Today we're going to be talking about risk quality management. So, unlike most other videos in this series, all of the tips that we discuss here today are actually fairly standalone. While there are many approaches to achieve and exceed expectations in this section of the rubric, it'll ultimately come down to what fits your project best. And in a similar thread, risk and quality management, while it is a specific rubric section, the frameworks that we discuss here today can be applied to many other different sections, and they'll often increase the effectiveness of your argument, because that's what a DECA paper is at the end of the day. It's just a fancy argument with better graphics. More specifically, risk and quality management will generally show up in project activities. We may see this in solutions if we're talking about how we anticipate potential downfalls in relation to our problems and solutions. We can even see it in budget or in conclusions and advanced financials when you're having to justify why you are worth the risk of, investing potentially $2 million into a project. So let's get started. We have so many different things that fall into risk and quality management, but for the sake of time, we had to pick the 4 biggest ones that we see in DECA mentoring. Primarily, these 4 are the ones that most students have ended up using. I've talked to a lot of students about the risk and quality management over the years, and if you find, I say over the years, but it's only been 2 years. If you find that these frameworks don't work, there are so many other frameworks out there, and I highly encourage you to go looking for them. But we'll be starting with lean risk boards, forecasting risk, red flag identification, and then quality control systems. So, starting with the lean risk board. The lean risk board is a diagnostic tool that we use to identify weak points in early stage projects, and it works by evaluating risks in 4 main dimensions: desirability, feasibility, viability, and usability. And together, these all work to capture a much more complete analysis of the potential risk factors for your project. We use the following questions to guide our assessment. First up is desirability. We're asking ourselves, do the users actually want this, and will they choose it over current alternatives? Just because you have the best product ever does not mean that it is the best in relation to the market. You need to have some sort of pull factor that makes customers overcome the friction barrier of switching and actually switch. Next up is feasibility. Can your team actually build and deliver the solution with the available resources? I see this show up the most with PM projects where students are failing to account for all of the resources that they need. And that makes sense. For a lot of DECA students doing a PM, this is the first time that they've been in a leadership position, or maybe they've taken on such a large project that involves all of these different little bureaucratic branches. That's fine, because DECA is a great place to learn. But you should be going into this aware that that is an issue that most students will hit. For example, if you've never paid for gas in your life, you might forget that gas is an expense that you have to list in the budget because it can pose a risk. What if, for example, you don't budget for gas high enough and then you have a variance and then you've got an additional thing later when you're looking at your actual versus your planned budget, and you see that you're off by an extra $50. And if you only had $20 of revenue, that $30 difference will be a lot. And a judge will look at that and they'll be able to see you didn't properly evaluate for risks. Next up is viability. And viability is asking the question, can the product generate revenue and scale efficiently? We see this a lot when we're looking at specific entrepreneurship events, such as international, franchise, and independent. The reason why we see these is because you're dealing with a very hostile market, or you're dealing with a lot of bureaucratic setup. If you're doing a really large, in-depth project that's going to be super focused like those, these are where we'll see issues. For example, international business plans would be very well advised to pay really close attention to scalability. And then finally, we have usability. And this is asking, can the average user who's never been introduced to your project before navigate your product without friction or confusion? Students in entrepreneurship events like innovation and startup are going to be the ones who most struggle with this category. Unless it's egregious, you can generally get away with not addressing usability risks too much at districts and association level, unless it's a super competitive state. There are some states where you will be expected at districts to already have this solved. However, at ICDC, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, you want to make sure that you've at least thought of answers surrounding usability risks. When all of the projects are great at ICDC, judges are looking for those little details to say no to a project. And this applies for both pitch decks and papers, for all 4 of these key areas. Even if you haven't included it in your paper because you have decided, okay, I don't need to tackle this, there's other more important things to tackle. Fine. But you do need to be prepared for potential questions relating to risk. And better yet, have a prop that pairs up with your project that you can leave with the judge, you can have the judge look at very briefly to at least showcase, here are the risks that we have identified, and here's what we're going to do to fix them. So once we focus on these 4 key areas and we've really thought about it and we've come up with a bunch of different answers, by the way, this is generally like a 1-hour minimum evaluation. You can split it up over a course of a few days if you want, but just go super deep and in-depth into this. We're going to answer these questions with an axis scoring system, and we're going to assign each axis a score from 1 to 5, where 1 is going to signal the highest risk and 5 is the lowest risk. And then obviously we're going to use the board to identify areas where the project is the weakest. And then from there, by addressing those lower scoring dimensions first, you're able to more effectively prioritize your time and resources. While it's awesome to say that you might get started in July, I already have students who are doing sessions with me right now, or they're talking in Go for Glass about how they're working on their projects and how they're going through this process of brainstorming. But some students may be introduced to this as late as November, or even a few weeks before their project or presentation is due. And so by focusing on those weakest areas, you can prioritize more effectively. So next up is we're going to be talking about how we forecast and we evaluate risk. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at failure mode forecasting. So failure mode forecasting is adapted from the FMEA methodology, which is used in manufacturing. And it's colloquially known as mini FMEA. I've heard some students call it mini FEMA, which is funny, so you might hear me slip up and say that. It is mini FMEA. The main use of this is to identify and prioritize potential points of failures in a process. So this is extremely valuable when we have things like complex workflows, and events like project management especially are going to benefit from at least integrating this into your brainstorming phase. Even if it doesn't get into your final paper, maybe it sticks to being a prop, maybe it's just something you prepare for questioning, it doesn't matter. This is one of the most effective ways for students to pinpoint potential pinch points later. And we're going to start by listing every realistic way our project can fail. And then we're going to assign 3 scores to each failure. First, we're going to look at severity. How damaging would this failure be? If this failure happens, is your entire project going to fall apart? For example, going back to that idea of gas. Let's say that we have a project where we are delivering baked goods around our community to raise money for something. If we overestimate how much we'll spend on gas, that's technically a failure because we did not accurately estimate, but it's not damaging at all. On a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the least risky and 1 is the riskiest, that'd be a 5 because that means we actually have extra budget to play around with because we overestimated how much gas would be. However, if we underestimated wildly how much gas would cost, you could rank that closer to like a 1 through a 3, depending on how underestimated it is. If for some reason it's $300 over what you estimated, that would be like a 1. Next up is likelihood. This is how likely it's going to be that this failure happens, how probable it is, all that good stuff. A really common probability might be your teammates in a project end up not having enough time to work on your project. And by the way, your failures and risks that you identify don't have to be just with your project. They can be with the operations of the project, the actual creating of it, especially when we're looking at community engagement or project management or anything like that. It's actually good to have those identified because it shows the judge that you are also being cognizant of the surrounding factors, not just your project itself, but also the team who's writing it, who's creating it. A low probability might be everybody catches the plague and dies and they can't finish your project. That's an extreme example. And finally is detectability. How difficult would it be to detect or prevent this failure from happening? And this ties into the idea that you should be evaluating as you go. But for example, let's talk about gas. Once again, say we underestimated how much our gas prices would be. We're halfway through our project, we realize, oh no, we've hit our limit on how much we can actually spend for gas. So maybe at this point, we'll make a little transparency note for ourselves. We've hit a failure. That's fine. We're going to move into our action plan. And we'll say, okay, at this point, we're going to increase our need for revenue. Let's say that we underestimated gas by $30. So now we have to get $30 extra in revenue in order to break even. Not ideal, but detectability, it's really easy to see when we've hit the limit where we don't have enough money for gas. However, something that might not be detectable is you get to the day of your event and you had a location booked, and then you discover, oh no, the location was accidentally double booked and the place where we rented out for an hour didn't realize it. That would be hard to catch. For detectability, when you're thinking of those hard to catch things, worst case scenario for many students is difficult to think of. So think about it from the terms of money, location, human resources, so like the labor, the people, and then like utility or consumable resources. Did you bring enough pens? Did you bring enough tape? Do you have enough product? Did you package your product in such a way that it won't be damaged? That's the sort of things you're going to think about with detectability. But at the end of that, once we've sort of listed every realistic way our project can fail, we're going to then multiply the scores or use a weighted approach, whichever works best for you, to find the most critical risks. Personally, I just do a 1 to 5 scale again. It just makes it easier for me. I can have it all in the same Excel spreadsheet. I can put it through a basic formula. And then, while in an ideal world we will prepare for everything, this is going to help you understand where to focus your mitigation efforts. We're going to have things we forget that we don't plan for. We are human. That should be our motto. We are human. We make mistakes. That's okay. So, when we're prioritizing those risks with the highest total scores for mitigation, you generally don't want to have every single risk you prepared for on your paper. You can have a prop document, but you might want to limit it to 1 to 2 pages. But having a visual, maybe like color-coded risk mitigation plan is one of those props that I see judges go nuts for. I think it just comes from industry experience, seeing so many things go wrong. I have prepared way more of these than I would care to admit in the last few years alone, because I do them for college classes, I do them just to track personal life things, and I do them for Go for Glass. I've made way more of these than I would care to admit, and they're always super helpful, and you learn every single time. And especially in project management cases, and I think there might be a couple of other events, I might just be blanking on them. They'll ask you if you had to take away from this any lessons to teach somebody else so that they could take your project and do it again and do it better this time. Failure mode forecasting is one of the easiest ways to demonstrate that you have prepared that scalable efficiency in the future. They can take your notes, they can build off of them. You already have these plans, even if they didn't end up being used. Even better if you can have a before and after. Your mini FMEA before you began, and then your mini FMEA at the end. If you encountered any projects or problems or risks or anything that wasn't on there, adding them later is a super strong way to showcase learning, growth, and get more points. That one's typically a prop though. All right, the targeted Q&A triangle. Whereas Mini FMEA is used in industries because it's easy to standardize, that does not work everywhere. In education, where the average experience is highly personalized, we can benefit from using a triangle, we can benefit from using a framework called the targeted Q&A triangle. This is a quality evaluation method, and it assesses 3 criteria. You'll notice that 3s and 4s are really common in quality methodology. I don't know why. But it's looking, first of all, at experience, outcome, and impact. Experience is, does the interaction feel intuitive and trustworthy? Outcome is, does the product or service actually deliver the promised benefit? And impact is, does the user leave with a meaningful result? Once again, this is when the average experience is highly personalized. You can see it in project management, but I've seen it more in, I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head, but the financial projects or community outreach, just the events that are talking about teaching. You see them a lot more there because they're trying to make sure that the program that they carried out that was intended to teach, that was intended to help students or members of their community develop connections and network. They can't really plan for a ton of risks. I mean, they should be planning for risks, but they can't really quantitatively look at the impact because often that requires long-term or longitudinal studies, and that just doesn't work. So the targeted Q&A triangle you'll generally do in stages throughout your project. You might do it at the 5-day mark when you have your prototype released and you're seeing if people like it. At the 15-day mark, when you've adapted it. At the 30-day mark, once you have a pretty good process and you're feeling good and you're just wanting to check in and see how it's going. And at the 45-day mark, when it's entirely finished, it's wrapping up, you're going through and you're seeing how the results have changed. Experience, outcome, impact. It's hard to give you more specific examples because this is so in tune to each individual product and each individual project that you'll run. Okay, so next up is we're going to talk about how we catch our red flags. So red flag testing is when we're going to diagnostically identify high-risk potential problems that have reputational, legal, or ethical implications. Here, we're going to want to use targeted prompts to self-reflect. For example, we could ask ourselves, does our marketing language for our gym, could that be interpreted as ableist? So can it be misunderstood or can it cause offense? If the answer is yes or even maybe, that right there could be a red flag. These issues, when they do arise, they're not going to break your product or your service. However, they can damage trust and alienate your customers. So exactly right there. When we're talking about trust, this is not something you'll see in many projects you actually carry out, like PMs. You will, however, see this more in ORs when you're dealing with a larger business. You might see this in certain ENT groups, but yeah, primarily I would say when we're talking about reputation and trust, those pre-established businesses, you might see it show up in franchise, maybe international, but ORs specifically when they're talking about, for example, FOR, or companies that are delivering credibility-based services, those are the companies that would be the most concerned about, once again, legal, reputational, or ethical implications. Okay, so building quality systems. To be more specific, we're going to talk about the quality loop sprint. The quality loop sprint is a rapid repetition model that helps refine quality by using direct user collaboration. It's typically used when you're working with content-based platforms or community-driven features. So if your project involves social media, for example, you would have to use that there. Or if you're launching an app, even if you plan on just using it as a prop for your project, you would use it there. This process has 4 main stages: plan, pilot, feedback, refine. Your plan is going to define what success looks like. At this point, you're going to want to set your own quality benchmarks for the release because your project can't really be compared to anybody else's at the very first bit. Your pilot, this is when you're going to release your product to a controlled group. Here, you're going to want to focus on those active users not the passive testers. What that means is don't just have your friend try it out for you. You're going to want to have somebody in your target market. If you're targeting ADHD students to give them a brand new study app, fine. If your friend is an ADHD student who needs help studying, have them pilot it. Or go out of your way. Community boards are a great way to ask. Reddit forums. It took me a long time to get around to this, or to come around to this. Reddit is actually a really great place as long as you're sticking to the proper subreddits, especially if you are looking at community boards primarily and you're using social media as a secondary way to reach out. Instagram, maybe not TikTok, sometimes YouTube, like if you do a video or something like that. You just want to make sure it gets to the right audience, and that's where subreddits and subcommunities actually can be useful. Feedback. You're going to be gathering both structured and unstructured responses. So that's combining things like surveys, which are structured. You actually have guiding questions. Not guiding questions. You have questions that help guide them through the process of identifying pieces you want to know. And then also things like comment logs. If you have reviews that they submit, or they leave a comment on an app, or they send in an email. Things like that would be unstructured. Use both structured and unstructured to conduct your analysis, because that way you're going to get more of an authentic, but then also a useful side of things. And then finally is refine. So it's pretty obvious. Here you're going to be adjusting your product. Additionally, you might have to revise your understanding of what quality means. Through pilot and feedback, you're going to get a lot of insights and a lot of input from your user, and you might realize, hey, I thought this feature for my ADHD students tool would be super helpful. I had 3-day notifications. Every 3 days, it would ping them if they were inactive, and it would kind of guilt trip them into coming back. But I had a lot of students reach out, and they told me, hey, I'm actually needing something a little bit more frequent, but you have to change your language because it makes me feel shame, and I uninstall this app. So maybe our definition of quality has to change. Next up is going to be risk logs. Honestly, I think that anytime you're in a group project, you should be having these no matter what. Even if it doesn't end up in your paper, risk logs are by far one of the easiest ways to prevent skirmishes within your group. So this is an ongoing internal tool that teams will use to track early warning signs before they escalate into actual problems. This is by no means a formal report. I typically just run mine on an Excel sheet. I don't even sometimes share it with my entire team. It might just be one for each team member I'm working with. Sometimes I'll do a larger one. It depends on what works for your team. And the rule is really simple. If your team has any moment of doubt, you're going to write it down. For example, I helped organize a lavender festival, and I just did this internally for me. I should have shared it with my full team, but it was just me doing this internship, and I didn't want to bother my boss. I would write things like, this vendor seems really hard to reach. Or, I'm concerned I'm sending emails on days that may not be useful. Or, I think that we might be relying too much on these images for our Instagram. We want to log the concern immediately. And then you want to review the risk log throughout the course of your project. So jumping back to DECA, leaving my personal examples, what is this feature going to potentially introduce legal complications? Are we relying too much on this one default message or response to a problem because we don't really have a great answer? Or I feel like we haven't properly communicated our schedules of availability to work on this project. For every single entry, as you're going through and reviewing the risk log, you're going to ask yourself, is this risk still present? Has this risk already occurred? And do we need some sort of guardrail or some sort of fallback? Do we need an established plan? Especially if you are wanting to use this as a prop, this works for project management. I do love to see this in a franchise, independent, and international business plan because those are talking about really large bureaucratic risks. There's a lot of corporate back and forth that has to go to get approved for those. So a risk log, for example, in the process of preparing can be interesting. You do have to sort of pivot when you are doing risk logs for those. It'll be more like, these are early warning signs you want to go through and approach, and you created a plan accordingly for them. It's not so much, I'm running the actual project right now and here's what I'm getting. So slightly different. All right, next up is the single source of truth, or SSOT. In any team, no matter how small it can be, it will get confusing when information lives in too many places. A single source of truth is going to put all of your operations in one hub. We should always designate one calendar for timelines and key dates, one task list for projects progress to be tracked, and one folder structure where all of your relevant assets live. I personally like platforms like Notion or Google Drive, but you have to make sure you pair them with really strict naming conventions and version control, especially if there's a lot of people touching it. Especially in like the grassroots teams, such as the ones you'll likely be working with in DECA, people generally default to texting and scattered DMs, and SSOT is going to prevent your project from falling apart. Go for Glass, our management team, uses these. Heck, using a Discord category with channels, having a server that you create just for your project, that would work as well. Just make sure that you are always adding to just that one place. It's super easy for people to lose the permissions or not have the proper links, and suddenly your project's lagging because somebody's in cello practice and somebody else needs the notes for target market, and suddenly you're stuck. Okay, so Brain Vaults. The Brain Vault is this catch-all document that preserves context across time. It's really similar to an SSOT. It's extremely useful in long-term projects or handoffs, and in my opinion is one of the absolute strongest props any project management event can have. I keep bringing up project management because they fit so well into risk and quality. It fits to a bunch of other events, especially at an ICDC level, because that's when your project has been running for months. And here we want to include decision rationales. Why did you choose to do what you did? It doesn't have to be sounding like good as you go through your project. You'll go through you will go through and draft it out. And you'll also probably have links to prior drafts or research. The difference between the SSOT and the Brain Vault is the Brain Vault is like one Google Doc in the SSOT. And every time you add something to the SSOT, you might add like a bullet point to your Brain Vault that just kind of rationalizes what you did there. You can kind of think of it as a really complicated, not user-friendly version of a table of contents. There should also be like an internally retained copy that's not given as a prop, but you still do use in your team. And that's where you have things like platform logins and passwords that you're storing securely. If you have an Instagram account that you run for your project, if you have a YouTube you're running for your project, if you have a Canva premium subscription that your entire group uses, which technically you should not do because that's sharing subscriptions, but you're all sharing your password and login, it all goes in that doc. There have been a lot of groups I've seen where they've lost that, or Instagram, I see mostly social media passwords being lost, or someone forgets to write it down because they're bad with passwords, and suddenly the rest of the group has to do this whole reset thing. Additionally, if there's any technical edge cases or formatting quirks, specifically if you're building an app or if you're building a website, if you've got anything technical going on, make sure you're writing those down. I will admit I'm not a coder, but there was a whole argument I got to witness last year in a group that was building an app. One person was using tabs and one person was using spaces for moving over coding blocks. Personally, I have no idea why that matters, but it was a very big argument, and they could have solved that by having a brain vault and discussing this. I think it was breaking their code or something because they weren't being consistent. Anyway, this whole record is just going to prevent that forgotten knowledge from being a blocker and a barrier. Additionally, it helps introduce this idea of reducing rework, and it also means you can onboard others more efficiently when it's needed. Overall, the biggest idea between risk and quality management is keeping your project clean, clear, and controlled. If there's one thing I had to add, just off the top of my head, that wasn't in this project, would probably be mission creep. Mission creep is inevitable. It's a fact of life. Your team members, your advisors, your feedback groups, or even likely you are going to suggest here, let's add just this one more thing to the task list at every phase. As a result, the only way to prepare for this is to add a margin of error. And you're going to add a 10% margin minimum to the following. Time. You always want to add buffer days to deadlines, and not just hours, add days. Your scope. You're going to want to leave space for at least one extra task per deliverable, if not 2 or 3. Deliverables could be weeks, could be months, up to your team. And then emotional bandwidth. I get a lot of chuckles from students when I ask them, how's the emotional bandwidth margin of error in your group? But you need to make sure that you're avoiding overcommitment, because that will prevent conflicts. A lot of teams like to overcommit their time, and it falls apart, and then their project suffers as a result. If you say, hey, this extra task is not actually going to take me a little bit extra time, I don't need 2 days, but I've got a lot going on in my life in those time, can I have those 2 days anyway? That's fine. That's really strong, actually. You can put that in your lessons learned. At the end of the day, the judge just wants to know that you learned from this, you grew from this, and honestly, who doesn't tear up a little bit at the story of a high school student learning to properly manage their time? Obviously, don't overdo it. That could be 1 or 2 sentences, but just include it. Anyway, that was Risk and Quality Management. Thank you so much for supporting us, and you have a wonderful rest of your day.